I think it's enormously to be welcomed that we see once again that there is a consensus across the House of Commons in favour of taking this issue with real seriousness. I recall the time when I first went to see the brother of the former leader of the Labour Party when he was then Environment Secretary, and I put to him that the Conservative Party, whose policy review I was then running, was prepared to move forward on a climate change bill, and he said to me rather memorably that he couldn't see any way to prevent a consensus breaking out. That consensus did then break out, and that Climate Change Act has actually protected the whole political class from what would otherwise, I think, have been a very great tendency of one party to score points off the other in relation to each particular measure, which is in itself potentially unpopular. As long as we can keep that consensus, then I agree with the former Secretary of State for Energy and former leader of the Labour Party that we can disagree from time to time about the means by which we achieve things and still move forwards very satisfactorily. The second point I want to make relates to the comments made both by him and by the other former Energy Secretary who has spoken. It is system change within the UK that is required, and it's only through system change that mass effects can be achieved. And we shouldn't expect people to take this on them individually as a sort of moral crusade. Some noble souls will, but the aggregate effect will be slight compared to system change. And system change needs to work with the grain of human nature. And that means, for example, in electrifying the car fleet, which is by far the greatest current shift that we can achieve, we need to solve range anxiety. Because the reason people don't buy electric cars, even those who can afford them and for whom it would in fact be a net saving, is that they're worried about the duration over which they'll be able to travel. And the fact is, if you ask yourself the crucial question, are you willing to have a car which might not get you home from the constituency, your answer will be no. There is a ready solution. NGC is already well invested in setting out plans for effectively recharging stations every 50 miles on our trunk roads so that you're never more than 50 miles from a recharging station. We're putting a huge amount of effort, and so are the car manufacturers, into improving battery storage. We can solve this problem. It requires sustained governmental effort over the succeeding 18 months or so to put us in a position where we could rival Norway. And then you start creating a virtuous circle, because as soon as the people who can already afford to do so start buying electric cars in sufficient quantities, the price of electric cars will fall naturally, and people who are less able to afford them at the moment will be able to afford them, after which they will fall yet further, and we then create exactly the kind of circumstances we've seen in the extraordinary revolution of information technology through the smartphone, of which there were almost none in the world 25 years ago, and of which there are now literally billions, including in many countries that are very impoverished. And that brings me to the last point I want to make, which is about the item that hasn't really been discussed terribly this afternoon, and which obviously will need an awful lot of discussion over the next few years. There are 2.6 billion people in our world, roughly speaking, living in India and China. They're living under circumstances which make climate change particularly significant for them. And not just because of air pollution issues which dominate in Chinese cities, but also because of the extreme tensions on the use of water, for example, in the borderlands between China and India. And both regimes are very conscious of these affairs. They're also conscious of the need to lift those 2.6 billion people, in the case of China, out of middle-income status and into being rich, or what they call moderately prosperous, and in the case of India, to lift literally hundreds of millions of people still in abject poverty up to the condition of middle income, as well as advancing the interests of those who are already enjoying middle incomes. And that requires a huge amount of additional activity and energy. And there's no way anybody preaching from this House or anywhere else in the world is going to tell those countries that they don't have a right to lift their populations into that kind of prosperity. And therefore, we in the West have a solemn duty to spend our time trying to work out how we can make it easier and cheaper for them to achieve that goal and to work with them to do it. And that requires a substantial realignment, not just of climate change policy, but of our entire Western foreign policy, which is, of course, too large a subject for me to dilate on at present. But I do hope that if we're going to take this forward, we take it forward with the seriousness that's required in our Foreign Office and across the Western world's Foreign Office establishments, and not just in our departments concerned with our own domestic affairs.
Preet Kaur Gill.